Imagine living on the same quiet Los Angeles street for almost your entire life. Your neighbours know you. They know your routines, the shops you walk to, the house you've lived in since your childhood. But then one day, you just stop appearing. Weeks pass and your neighbours become concerned. But then a woman they've barely seen before begins emptying your house. The dumpsters arrive and your possessions disappear. Workmen begin renovating the property. And whenever anybody asks where you are, the woman has an answer. She says you're fine and you're staying somewhere else and you're coming back. She even produces documents apparently proving that you've given her control over your affairs, but there's just one problem. You're already dead. And while your neighbours are being reassured that everything is perfectly normal, the people who know the truth are allegedly beginning to discover just how much money can be made from keeping a dead man alive. This is the story of Charles Welding, a man whose identity, property and wealth would be systematically taken from him, while nobody could even find his body. And eventually investigators would discover that Charles wasn't the only victim. Walking to closing crimes. Where do we begin? Well, long before anybody was asking what happened to Charles Welding, he was simply the quiet man who lived on Kingswood Road. Known as Charles Howard Welding Jr., was born in 1951 in the small brick house in Sherman Oaks, California, where much of this story would eventually unfold, wasn't somewhere he moved to later in life. It was home. He'd grown up there, and his parents had raised him there. Even as the decades changed around him, Charles largely stayed where he had always been. Sherman Oaks sits in Los Angeles' San Fernando Valley. And although Los Angeles is usually imagined as a city of constant movement, Kingswood Road was the sort of residential street where people noticed their neighbours. And Charles was difficult not to notice, precisely because he seemed determined not to be noticed at all. People who knew him described him painfully shy. He wasn't someone constantly inviting friends over or filling the driveway with visitors, because he kept largely to himself. Neighbours occasionally saw him walking to the shops, including a nearby Whole Foods, sometimes dressed unusually heavily for the California weather. People would offer him lifts, and he usually declined. People tried to help, but Charles seemed more comfortable handling life alone. For decades, one constant remained: his mother, June. Charles continued living with her in the family home well into adulthood. In 2017, June passed away. And suddenly, the already isolated Charles became even more alone. There is something important about understanding that before we go any further, because Charles wasn't simply a name attached to a property deed. He wasn't just an elderly man with an estate. He was a real person who had spent most of his life in one house, surrounded by people who recognized him even if they didn't know him particularly well. And that isolation would eventually become incredibly important, because by 2020, Charles had something that made him unusually vulnerable. He had valuable assets. He lived alone. And very few people saw him regularly enough to immediately know when something was wrong. Then came the pandemic. For somebody already living an extremely private life, COVID made disappearing from public view remarkably easy. Charles reportedly placed signs around his property warning people to stay away. Seeing less of him suddenly wasn't strange because everyone was seeing less of everyone. And his weeks of isolations became months, a neglected-looking house on an affluent Los Angeles street began attracting the attention of somebody for an entirely different reason: Matthew Kroth. Kroth would later describe a form of burglary he called urban exploring, but there was apparently a method behind the properties he targeted. According to prosecutors, Kroth looked for homes in expensive areas that appeared neglected. All visual clues suggesting that whoever owned the property might be elderly, absent, or otherwise unable to maintain it. and Charles Welding's home was caught by his attention. Kroth began watching it. He apparently believed the house might be empty, and sometime during the summer of 2020, he decided to find out. Kroth entered the property, but the house wasn't empty. Charles was, in fact, inside. Imagine that moment from Charles' perspective. You've deliberately isolated yourself during a pandemic. You're alone inside the home you've lived in for decades. And suddenly, there's a stranger inside of it. Kroth reportedly called out he was conducting some kind of welfare check. Charles responded. Kroth realised the owner was very much alive, and so he left. That should have been the end of it. A failed burglary. A frightening intrusion that unfortunately hadn't escalated any further. Except Kroth didn't forget the house. He kept watching it. And months later, he returned. This time, Charles didn't answer. According to the account Kroth would later give investigators, he entered the house again and discovered Charles Welding dead inside. Exactly how Charles died remains one of the most important unanswered questions in this entire story. There was no police investigation at that moment. No coroner arrived to examine the body, and no doctor established a cause of death, because Kroth didn't call anybody. Instead, according to federal prosecutors, he began stealing. Jewellery, personal possessions, and mail, financial documents, and those pieces of paper would change everything. Because as Kroth looked through what Charles had left behind, it became clear that the quiet man in the neglected house possessed something far more valuable than the items that could simply be carried through the front door. Charles had an estate, he had property, he had financial accounts and investments, and most importantly, there was now nobody obviously standing between those assets and the people who possessed his personal information, because Charles was dead. But almost nobody knew it. And if nobody knew Charles was dead, then, on paper at least, Charles could do almost anything. He could apparently sign documents, he could apparently give somebody power of attorney, he could apparently move house. All somebody needed was enough information to impersonate him. And Kroth had just walked out of Charles' house, doing exactly that. This is where Herrling enters the story. What followed wasn't simply somebody stealing Charles' credit card and spending a few $1,000s. Charles' personal information and financial documents began circulating among people with different criminal guilts, and Herrling would become central to what investigators ultimately described as the multi-million-dollar fraud conspiracy. Documents were created that purported to give her authority over Charles' affairs, paperwork that could transform a stranger into somebody who appeared legally entitled to speak for Charles Welding. And, that distinction matters, because if you're breaking into someone's house and taking their money, you're obviously stealing from them. But if you can create paperwork that makes a bank, estate attorney, or a property company believe the owner has authorized you, suddenly you're not behaving like a burglar. You walk through the front door, you make appointments, you open accounts, and you sign forms, so you tell everyone you're supposed to be there. Before long, Caroline Herrling wasn't hiding from Charles' neighbours, she was standing right in front of them. Then the people living around Pinkwood Road began noticing changes. Charles hadn't been seen, but there was suddenly activity at the house. A woman that many of them did not recognise seemed to have taken control of the property, and that woman was in fact Caroline Herrling. So naturally, people asked questions. Where was Charles, and why was somebody clearing out his home? Herrling had explanations. She claimed to know the Welding family. She presented herself as somebody legitimately involved with Charles' estate. The house, she said, had problems. There was mould, and so the house, it needed work. Charles wasn't missing. He had simply gone somewhere else while the renovations were completed. At one point, neighbours even received a letter explaining that Charles had temporarily relocated to Carpintero, a coastal city northwest of Los Angeles. It was reassuring, and it was specific, to say the least. and completely incompatible with what investigators would later learn. Because Charles hadn't moved to the coast. Charles wasn't waiting for his house to be renovated. Charles was dead. Yet the story worked remarkably well because everything surrounding it appeared official enough to discourage immediate suspicion. If anybody could disappear for a few months without immediately causing panic, it was him. But his neighbours knew his habits and something still felt wrong. Eventually, somebody decided that explanations weren't enough. They wanted Charles himself. On December 22nd, 2020, police arrived at the house. A neighbour had reported that Charles hadn't been seen for months. This was the moment the entire scheme could have collapsed. Officers were standing at Charles Welding's home, asking a very simple question. Where is Charles? Herrling spoke with them. She told officers she was trustee of a Welding estate. She repeated that Charles wasn't currently living at the property and that the house was undergoing work because of problems including mold. Charles, she maintained, was elsewhere. Police searched the house. They didn't find him, but crucially, they did not find his body either. And without a body, without obvious evidence of violence, and with a woman standing there claiming legal authority over his affairs, the situation remained confusing. Adult detective services also became involved, and when something happened that gave Herrling's version of events an extraordinary amount of credibility. A caseworker apparently spoke on the telephone with a man believed to be Charles Welding. The man repeated the same basic story. He was fine. He was away. There was seemingly nothing to rescue him from, and on January 8, 2021, the Adult Protective Services case was closed. Think about that. Charles Welding was dead. His home was being emptied, documents were being used to take control of his assets, and yet an official investigation into his welfare had just ended after somebody apparently spoke to him on the phone. Whoever was running this scheme hadn't merely taken Charles' possessions, they had found a way to manufacture his continued existence even after death. And with these questions temporarily silenced, the fraud could grow. What happened next is where this story becomes almost difficult to believe. Among the documents connected to the Welding family was information involving another estate. A woman named Jackie Lowenstein had died, and according to federal prosecutors, Herrling claimed to have discovered something extremely convenient, a will. This supported will named Charles Welding as an executor and a beneficiary of Lowenstein's estate, an estate worth well over $1 million. There were two enormous problems. Investigators concluded the will was forged, and Charles Welding, the man supposedly inheriting money, was already dead. But almost nobody outside the conspiracy knew that. So the structure of the alleged fraud became extraordinary. A dead woman's estate was supposedly passed on to a dead man. The dead man's death was being concealed, and the people pretending to control the dead man's estate could therefore position themselves to benefit from the dead woman's assets. Charles' identity had become something more useful than Charles himself. As long as the world believed he was alive, his name could continue opening doors. And according to the prosecutors, the group didn't stop with Charles, they began looking elsewhere. Investigators would later allege that affluent properties were being identified through surprisingly simple clues. A neglected swimming pool, a house that looked so nobody was taking care of it, potential signs that behind or might be somebody elderly and absent. Charles Welding had not simply become a victim, his case appeared to have helped expose a method. And then another house entered the story. This one belonged to a man named Robert Tascon. Its value ran into the millions. Tascon was still alive. He had not agreed to sell it, and yet, before long, somebody else would sell it anyway. So as we know, Robert Tascon was still alive. That point matters, because unlike Charles Wilding, whose death had allowed others to speak in his name without immediate contradiction, Tascon was still very much capable of objecting to what was happening. He owned a valuable home in Encino, another affluent part of Los Angeles. The property was worth millions, but Tascon was dealing with serious problems of his own, and while he was away in Texas, squatters had occupied the house. He was already fighting to regain control of his own property when something even more extraordinary happened. According to prosecutors, Caroline Herrling and her associates created fraudulent documents, arranged for somebody to impersonate Tascon and then sell his house. A house he had never agreed to sell. Transaction reportedly closed for around $1.5 million. Think about what that means. Somewhere in Los Angeles, paperwork was passing between professionals, money was moving through escrow, signatures were being accepted, and a multi-million-dollar property was changing hands, whilst the actual owner was nowhere near the transaction. Questions inevitably arose. Why was the owner absent? Why was the house being sold below its potential value? And why did the transaction need to move so quickly? And prosecutors said Herrling had an answer for that too. He allegedly presented herself as Tascon's attorney. The same strategy that had worked with Charles was now being applied to someone else. Don't simply steal an asset, create enough paperwork that everybody else helped you take it. And when the sale closed, investigators would later trace huge amounts of money into accounts associated with Herrling and others in the conspiracy. Robert Tascon eventually discovered that his house had effectively been sold from underneath him. By then, the danger and the damage was, well, it was just enormous. Tascon was already facing serious personal difficulties, and prosecutors would later argue that losing such an important asset dramatically worsened his financial situation. In 2022, Robert Tascon died by suicide. It is important, however, not to simplify his death into a single cause. Human lives rarely work that way, but prosecutors would later point to the loss of his property as another example of just how devastating this conspiracy had become. Because this wasn't paperwork anymore. These were not just numbers moving between bank accounts, real people were being left behind. And still, Charles Wilding had not been found. By late 2021, there was finally somebody asking the questions that had been avoided for far too long. Detective Mark O'Donnell of the Los Angeles Police Department received an anonymous tip. The caller's message was disturbing. Charles Wilding wasn't simply missing, the caller claimed he was dead. And worse, people were allegedly using the fact that nobody knew about his death to take control of his identity and his money. Suddenly the strange activity on Kingswood Road looked very different. All of the renovations and the stories and the supposed telephone call with adult protective services. And so, the detective O'Donnell contacted Herrling. He wanted something simple. If Charles was alive, put him on the phone. At first, that request sounds almost too easy. If Herrling was telling the truth, it should have ended the entire investigation in minutes. Just let Charles speak, let him confirm his identity, and let everyone go home. Herrling eventually called back. She said Charles was there with her. A man came onto the telephone and he claimed to be Charles Wilding. And so O'Donnell started asking questions. Not philosophical questions or complicated questions, just some basic identification information. Only information the real Charles Wilding should have known. His social security information, his driver's license details. The man struggled, and suddenly the conversation that was supposed to prove Charles was alive began doing the exact opposite. The supposed Charles then provided an address in Simi Valley, where he could apparently be found. So O'Donnell went there. And when he arrived, the man living at the address had another problem for Herrling's story. He said he barely knew Charles, and he hadn't seen him in years. Now the detective wasn't dealing with a missing eccentric who had chosen to disappear. He was dealing with somebody apparently constructing a living version of a dead man, and one small piece of paperwork would make that even harder to explain. During an encounter with Herrling, O'Donnell noticed a receipt. It was for a phone connected to the number that had been presented as Charles. The number supposedly allowing investigators to reach the man who had disappeared appeared to lead straight back toward the woman insisting he was alive, and the illusion was beginning to crack. By this point, the investigation was becoming too large to treat as a conventional missing person case because it wasn't just about Charles. There were estates and bank accounts and potential forged wills. There were people pretending to be other people. So, in 2022, investigators brought in Postal Inspector Lyndon Versosa to begin pulling apart the financial side. And once the money started talking, the scale of the operation became much clearer. Bank records connected Herrling and others to the proceeds from the Tascon property sale. Investigators began finding links between transactions viewed separately that might have looked legitimate, but together they painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Charles Welding's identity was at the centre of one scheme. Robert Tascon's property was part of another. The estate of Jackie Lewenstein appeared in another, and prosecutors began regarding the group not as people who had stumbled onto a single opportunity, but as a loose network whose members brought different skills to the same basic objective. By the time investigators conservatively calculated the losses, they reached approximately $3.8 million. More than $2 million of that was traced for accounts controlled by Herrling, and that financial structure helped investigators answer an important question. Who was actually running all of this? The money increasingly pointed toward Herrling, but there was still one problem that couldn't be solved by a bank statement. Where was Charles? Because even if investigators could prove the documents were fraudulent, even if they could prove people were impersonating him, even if they could prove millions of dollars had been moved, they still did not have a Charles Welding. And what investigators eventually learned about his remains would transform the case again. According to federal prosecutors, after Charles died, his body remained inside the Sherman Oaks property for some time. Eventually, Herrling and others moved his remains away from the house, and prosecutors said there was an attempt to destroy the body chemically. Supplies were purchased, and items intended to control smell and contain the remains. The attempt apparently did not work, so the plan changed. Investigators said Charles' remains were dismembered and packed. Bones and teeth were allegedly damaged in an effort to make future identification harder. Then the remains were transported hundreds of miles north toward the San Francisco Bay Area, and this is where one of the strangest details in the entire case appears. According to prosecutors, Herrling rented a muscle car for the trip north. Once there, another conspirator with access to a sailboat helped dispose of Charles' remains in San Francisco Bay. Prosecutors even described photographs showing Herrling smiling during parts of that trip. Afterwards, he reportedly returned to Los Angeles by private jet. There was something deeply unsettling about that contrast, not because it's dramatic, but because it's actually quite casual. A man's body had been transported across California and allegedly thrown into the bay, and surrounding it were rental cars and photographs and travel arrangements. A journey that from the outside could have almost looked like some sort of holiday. Charles Welding's remains have never been recovered. And because they were never recovered, investigators lost something far more important than physical evidence of the fraud, because they lost their best opportunity to determine how Charles died. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question at the center of this entire case. Charles died naturally? Was his death accidental? Or was somebody else involved? Investigators have never been able to establish the answer. Herrling was never convicted of murdering Charles. Kroth and Farrell was already dead when he returned to the house. Authorities have said the exact circumstances of Charles' death remain uncertain, and because the body was destroyed and the house extensively altered, it is entirely possible that the evidence needed to answer that question disappeared forever. In January 2023, investigators finally began closing in. Search warrants were executed at properties connecting to Herrling, and what they found suggested that the forged documents connected to Charles and Tascon were only a part of a much stranger world. Authorities recovered identity documents belonging to other people. They reported found papers showing what appeared to be repeated practice attempts at reproducing June Welding's signature. Investigators found equipment capable of reproducing signatures. They also found numerous firearms, drugs, and counterfeit or stolen-looking law enforcement credentials. With a fake FBI identification card, Arian Herrling's photograph, document marked to resemble sensitive government material, and yet none of that proved that Charles had been murdered. But it did help investigators understand the level of deception they were dealing with. This wasn't somebody panicking after making one bad decision. This was an operation that depended on creating false identities, false authority, and false realities convincing enough to survive contact with banks and government offices. Eventually, Herrling was arrested, and the woman who had spent years claiming authority over Charles Welding's life was now facing the possibility of decades in federal prison. In March 2023, Caroline Herrling pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud, not murder, and that distinction matters. The federal case focused on the fraud operation, the false identities, stolen assets and property schemes. Investigators could prove those things, but what they could not prove was how Charles Welding died. Matthew Kroth also eventually pleaded guilty in connection with the conspiracy, along with a separate drug offence. The same man who had first noted the neglected house, who had broken in and discovered Charles alive, who later returned and found him dead, had inadvertently started the chain of events that would expose an entire criminal enterprise. But by the time sentencing arrived, the numbers alone didn't seem large enough to describe what had happened. Nearly $4 million had been lost, properties had been taken, but the most disturbing part of the case, the most difficult to put into a spreadsheet, was that Charles Welding had essentially been turned into a tool. Even the fact that very few people would immediately notice his absence in value. Charles himself appeared to have become the least important part of Charles Welding's estate. In March 2024, Caroline Herrling stood before a federal maximum sentence available for the charge was 20 years. The judge gave her all 20. She was also ordered to pay more than $3.8 million in restitution. In sentencing, Judge Mam Iwusi Mensah Frimpong focused attention back toward the person who had almost disappeared from his own story, Charles. Human being. He wasn't in a state or a signature or a property, and that may be the most important way to understand this case, because when you first hear what happened, the scale of the fraud grabs your attention. A dead man supposedly answering phone calls. Millions of dollars. But the more you look at it, the story becomes less about financial crime and more about invisibility. Charles was isolated enough when he stopped appearing. The lie that he had simply moved away seemed believable. He was private enough that somebody else could claim to speak for him, and he had enough wealth that once he was gone, people allegedly discovered that pretending he was still alive could be incredibly profitable. And the case didn't completely end with Herrling's sentencing. In February 2026, Matthew Kroth was sentenced to 200 months in federal prison, 16 years and 8 months. He was also ordered to pay nearly $2 million in restitution. Federal prosecutors described Kroth as the person who effectively began the entire chain of events targeting
Charles' property,
and later removing Charles' personal information after finding him dead. More than 5 years after Charles disappeared from Kingswood Road, one of the final major participants in the scheme had received his sentence. But the most basic question you'd normally expect a criminal investigation to answer first, remains unanswered. Somewhere beneath the waters and in San Francisco Bay, there may once have been evidence that could have told investigators exactly what happened inside that quiet Sherman Oaks house in 2020. Evidence of illness, evidence of an accident, or maybe evidence of something else, but we just don't know. And because Charles' remains were never uncovered, we may never know. That's what makes this case so unraveling. Usually, when somebody disappears, investigators search for the person. Here, people allegedly found a way to profit from the disappearance itself. They didn't simply take Charles Wilding's possessions, they took control of him. They turned him into a piece of paperwork, and for a while, the paperwork was more convincing than the truth. Eventually, Caroline Herrling was exposed. Money trail was followed. Fraud was closed. But our case was never truly closed, because behind every forged signature, every fake phone call, and every dollar moved through those accounts was a man who lived quietly in the same house for almost 70 years. A man who vanished. A man who, even after millions of dollars were traced and decades of bidding were hand-found, still has no official establishment cause of death. Maybe that's the darkest part of this story, not that somebody managed to steal Charles Wilding's identity after he died, but that for a period of time, the world accepted the fake version of Charles more easily than it noticed the real one was gone. This has been Closing Crimes, where we go beyond the headline, follow the evidence, and uncover the details that turn a crime into a story worth remembering. If you enjoyed this investigation, subscribe for more carefully researched cases from the past and present, because some crimes end with a conviction, other ends with a question, and this one still hasn't been completely closed.